The Grand Hotel Mystery. Welcome to Silent Clues. I'm your host, Benedict, and I'm so glad you're here. There's something wonderfully comforting about sharing a quiet mystery together no matter where in the world you're watching from. I always wonder, how do you make time for these quiet mysteries? Do you listen while walking, knitting, baking, or winding down at night? Tell me your ritual in the comments. I read them all with a smile. Now, make yourself a warm cup of tea or coffee, and let's begin. Let's dive into today's case. Chapter 1. Arrival in the Rain. The rain fell in bright needles that stitched the sea to the sky and turned the great glass canopy of the Grand Hotel into a dim, humming drum. Miss Marple arrived with a small suitcase and a folded umbrella. The umbrella neatly furled in the manner of a woman who disliked fuss, yet disliked damp corridors even more. The porter in a dark coat stepped smartly forward, and in the same instant hesitated, as though some other duty pressed him from within the lobby. She noticed the hesitation, because she noticed everything, and because the lobby itself seemed to be breathing rather quickly. The doors sighed, and warm light enclosed her like a lamp trimmed high against the gale. Crystal bulbs burned low beneath carved plaster. Palms stirred in brass tubs, and a smell of beeswax and salt air drifted through the hall. Guests crossed and recrossed the checkered floor, each with an air of arrival or escape, and the staff moved among them with expressions that were polite and not at all serene. There were whispers, quick as moth wings. A young chambermaid passed with a stack of folded towels and an anxious mouth, and the concierge watched the lift as if it were a thermometer in fever. Miss Marple presented herself at the desk, and the manager, a large man with careful hair, greeted her with the full solemnity owed to a gentlewoman who travelled alone and paid her bill promptly. She gave her name, and he found it at once in the ledger, and in his relief his pen blotted the page with a single round tear of ink. Blots always interested Miss Marple, since people do not blot their ink without reason. She allowed her suitcase to roll away in the care of a boy whose buttons shone bravely and whose eyes tried not to dart. He carried the case as if it were lighter than his conscience. The bell at the swing doors rang twice, and a gust swept rain across the threshold, and two gentlemen entered wrapped in damp collars, talking loudly about docks and ships and something that would not bear delay. They noticed no one, which is always noticeable. A woman in pearls sat on a velvet settee, the pearls a shade too white in the electric light, and watched the lift with the calm of a person who had practiced calm for many years. Beyond her, a honeymoon couple held hands with the shy concentration of those who have not yet learned to quarrel in public. The manager leaned toward the concierge, and they exchanged a glance which was not meant to be exchanged at all. It was the glance of people who had already decided to say as little as possible until someone else spoke first. Miss Marple took off her gloves and placed them together on the desk, fingers to fingers, as if the gloves were listening. It is always useful to appear fussy when one wishes to be left alone to observe. A draught crept across the marble and set the palms whispering again. The rain battered the glass roof in steady ranks, and the sea answered with a rough hiss, and all the while the hotel glowed like a lantern set against a storm, proud and a trifle frightened of its own brightness. "Your suite overlooks the sea, madam," said the manager, his tone invested with gratitude for a simple truth. "The view is very fine when the weather lifts." "When the weather lifts," said Miss Marple with a mild smile, "everything is very fine." The bellboy led her to the lift, which rose with a sigh as patient as an old horse. They passed a floor where a maid buffed a brass doorplate until her hands trembled, and another floor where a door stood ajar and a man in shirt-sleeves paced, and the boy looked fixedly ahead, as boys do when they have seen more than is comfortable. Miss Marple made a small remark about the rain, and the boy said, "Yes, miss," and then, after an instant, "No, miss," which was more truthful if less obedient. On the landing, a long corridor ran out like a quiet river, carpeted deep, lit by shaded lamps that made islands of light and seas of shadow. He set down the case and unlocked the door, and inside the suite a pale fire flickered in the grate, and the windows were a blur of water and shifting slate. There was a writing desk and a vase of chrysanthemums, white and faintly edged with pink, and a silver bell that looked as though it could be rung for almost anything except peace. Miss Marple gave the boy a coin and an elderly smile, which is better than 2 coins for a boy who has been worried by grown people all day. He coloured, thanked her, and then, because kindness pricks like a pin, blurted that the hotel was busy for the storm season, and busier for other reasons, and then shut his mouth as if the other reasons had teeth. She did not press him. A boy who shuts his mouth so firmly will only hurt himself if one pries at it. Instead, she laid her gloves on the mantel, adjusted the fire to a more honest flame, and stood a moment at the window. The sea heaved in black ridges, shouldering white foam, and far out the lightship burned a steady dot in the rain. Somewhere a foghorn groaned, patient and resigned. She unpacked with small, precise movements, set her comb on the dressing table, and placed her needle case beside the bed, since needles have solved more troubles than pistols. A kettle sang in the adjoining room, and she brewed tea that tasted faintly of salt, and she sat down to it with the even gratitude of a woman who knew that hot tea has rescued more souls than rhetoric. When the cup was empty, she returned to the corridor, because rest, like digestion, is best promoted by a little mild walking, and because people who are anxious will often show you their anxiety when they think you have lost your way. On the landing near the lift, a housekeeper conferred with a groom in a voice too soft for words and too clear for secrecy. They looked up, as one looks up from a letter that is not signed. In the lounge, a pianist practiced the same neat phrase again and again, and each time the final note sat down a little crookedly. A waiter carried a silver tray with the dignity of a bishop and the speed of a sinner, and disappeared behind a screen where conversations grew quiet and then grew quieter. Miss Marple wandered toward the entrance hall and looked at the umbrella stand. There were several sticks and one walking cane of a sort that leaves a mark if used for more than walking. Its ferrule was clean, which meant it had been wiped in a hurry, and people wipe canes in a hurry only when they have remembered something they wish they had not done. The revolving door turned and brought in a thin man with pale lips, who went at once to the desk and spoke in a tone that crept rather than walked. He used the phrase as agreed, which is a phrase that never means anything good. The manager said certainly, and his forehead shone, and the concierge wrote a note and folded it in 2, and a page darted away like a small fish. A gust shook the glass, and the pearls on the velvet settee caught the light like frost. The woman wearing them rose and drifted toward the crystal bar, and the thin man watched her go, and his lips grew paler, and the manager watched the thin man, and the concierge watched the door of the lift, and Miss Marple watched all of them, and thought how very fatiguing it must be to carry so many secrets on such a wet night. A bell rang from the lift, a clear, pretty sound, and a gentleman in a square-shouldered coat stepped out with a briefcase that wished to be a friend and had never been one. He looked round as if counting chairs, and the concierge bowed too low and held out a key that he ought not to have had in his hand. The gentleman took the key with a small frown of possession, and the lobby seemed to change its breathing again. Miss Marple sat on a small chair near a palm, and looked as if she were thinking about knitting patterns. She considered how easily a hotel can become a little town, with its own mayor and its own market and its own rumour, and how a storm will shut the gates of such a town and make the inhabitants look at one another too closely. She considered the sound the lift made when it rose, and how often it rose, and what floor it chose as its resting place, since mechanical things betray their friends as readily as human ones. Her tea had been mild, but her curiosity sharpened it, and in time she returned to her room and wrote 3 neat lines in a small notebook. The first line recorded the flutter of whispers in the lobby. The second noted the key offered without request. The third observed that storms drive people indoors, and that people who would rather not be indoors together always give themselves away. Outside, the rain thickened and then thinned, and then thickened again, as if the sky had remembered a quarrel and could not decide whether to end it. The sea sighed, and somewhere a door shut with careful force, and footsteps passed her door and returned and passed again, slower the second time. Miss Marple put away her notebook and folded her hands and listened, because listening is the most polite way of hearing things you are not supposed to know. The wind rattled the sash, and the fire answered with a steadier glow, and in the distance a clock struck the hour with calm conviction. She smiled to herself, a small smile that had nothing to do with amusement and everything to do with recognition. A hotel in a storm is a very good place for a rest, provided one is not trying to wrest from the truth. She turned down the lamp and let the rain do its quiet work, and the grand hotel went on glowing like a lantern in the night, and its inhabitants went on keeping their balances, and the night, which knows more than it tells, drew in around the cornice and listened with her. Chapter 2. The Suite with a View. Morning uncurled itself from the storm with a tired smile, and the sky wore a colour that suggested clean linen hung in a draught. Miss Marple drew back the curtains and found the sea laid out below like a restless sheet pinned by rocks. From her height, the hotel terrace and the carriage sweep were small theatres, and she had a good seat. The entrance canopy threw off last night's rain in a steady dripping, and beneath it a man stood as if the canopy were a pulpit and the pavement his congregation. He did not smoke, which would have given his hands employment, and he did not read, which would have given his eyes somewhere else to be. Instead, he watched the doors with an attention that would have embarrassed a bride. Cabs came and went, and each time he eased a little to one side to see who stepped down, then returned to his first position, patient as a fisherman and twice as alert. He was not of the hotel, for his coat had the resigned look of a garment that must meet weather rather than guests, and his hat brim bore a pale tide mark where the rain had lain. Miss Marple observed him without any movement that could be called interest. She had learned that people who wish not to be noticed mind chiefly whether you turn your head. She boiled water for tea on the small spirit stove provided for such domestic adventures, and let the window stand open a few inches so the room might hold both warmth and salt air. The fire waited in the grate, obedient and faint, and the sea made its steady counsel below. On the writing desk lay hotel paper stamped with a crest that attempted heroism and achieved comfort, and beside it a pencil lately sharpened by an impatient hand. She took her notebook and wrote 2 words: entrance watcher. After breakfast on a tray, she went down to the lounge, pausing by the stair to look at a painting of waves that tried very hard to be waves. The pianist had improved his last note, which pleased her, because improvement in small things often precedes disaster in large ones. The crystal bar lay dark and mirrored, sleeping off last night's brilliance, and the velvet settee had a faint impression where the woman in pearls had reclined. A young couple passed holding a guidebook between them as if it were a treaty. They blushed when their hands touched, which is a good sign in treaties and in marriages. At the desk, the manager spoke softly to the concierge, and the concierge answered in the tone of a man who has been told that nothing is wrong and must therefore behave as if everything is right. Miss Marple asked for a walking map and thanked them in the manner of a person determined to admire the cliffs, even if they insisted on collapsing. On the way back to the lift, she heard voices in the service passage, shaped by the habit of speaking where guests cannot hear and the necessity of speaking anyway. The words came round the corner like parcels passed hand to hand. "I tell you it has been troublesome all week," said a young woman with the dry indignation of underpaid efficiency. "Room 312 again, and not a single day without a summons. If it is not the window latch, it is the bell, and if it is not the bell, it is hot water, and if it is not hot water, it is a smell of smoke that is not smoke at all." Another voice answered with patience and fatigue in equal measure. "You should not say the number out loud, Milly," said the housekeeper, "for the walls are not deaf even when the guests pretend to be." The girl snorted in a way that tried to be respectful and failed. If the walls are not deaf, then the room could have told us what it wants by now. Miss Marple continued along the main corridor with the mild pace of someone who has mislaid her spectacles and is sure they will be found by not searching. 312, she repeated silently, and filed it in the shelf of her mind that had once been labelled Parish Registries, and now bore a more elastic title. In the lift, she met the boy who had carried her case, and found him paler by daylight. He was ducking his head over a bundle of letters, and one envelope had a smear of blue on the flap where it had been sealed in a hurry. "Morning, miss," he said, and then flushed as if morning were too bold a greeting. "The sea is finer from up there," he added, which was safe ground and poor camouflage. "It is finer and more honest," said Miss Marple, "because distance takes the vanity out of a wave." He laughed, relieved by a sentence that sounded like nothing and meant that he could be left alone. She returned to the suite and stood again at the window, for habit and the view suited one another. The entrance watcher remained faithful to his post. Once he spoke to a driver who shook his head with the authority of a man who knows the price of petrol. Then the watcher returned to stillness. A tradesman's cart rattled into the courtyard and set up near the kitchen steps, its painted letters shining wetly. For a moment the tailboard dropped, and a neat array of tools glinted, and a small vice showed its teeth like a polite dog. The cart moved on and was lost beneath the overhang by the service door. Miss Marple took no notice that could have been seen, but a note added itself to her earlier words: "Courtyard tradesman." Near noon the clouds parted into rags and gave up a pale sun, and with the sun came guests who wished to be seen admiring it. The woman in pearls appeared in a soft grey suit, and spoke to the manager as one duke might speak to another in a private matter. Her pearls lay motionless against her throat. A square-shouldered gentleman crossed the hall with the briefcase that had long ago declined intimacy, and when he passed the desk, the concierge's hand twitched toward the keyboard and then thought better of it. People came and went, and each going and coming drew the eyes of the watcher under the canopy. He lifted his head even for the postman, which told Miss Marple that he was not waiting for a person only, but for a pattern, and that patterns are more treacherous than people. In the afternoon she took her knitting to the Palm Court and asked for tea. There the society ladies had arranged themselves like well-bred geese around a pond, and the talk had that satisfying ripple which suggests nothing and carries everything. A name drifted past like a leaf, and sank before she could catch it. A rumour about a ship in harbour followed, and a remark about a businessman who was too pleased with his own success, and laughter that remembered to be discreet. Milly the chambermaid entered with a tray, and left with a sigh. A minute later Miss Marple rose as if to admire a palm frond, and took the longer way back to the corridor where the service stairs began. There she found Milly leaning on the banister with the air of a girl who would prefer justice to 10 minutes' rest, and suspects she will get neither. "It is an unkind house when nothing works all at once, miss," she said, not so much to Miss Marple as to the ceiling. Miss Marple said that houses had tempers like horses, and that some rooms never forgave a draught. Milly looked at her quickly, and then away. 312 is not a room, she said, and coloured because she had meant to say nothing. It is a chore with walls, and I shall be glad when it goes back to being a number. She gathered up her cloths and went down the steps, and her shoes tapped a message that no one answered. Miss Marple wrote in her notebook, "Troublesome for a week," and then added, "Staff told to be silent," which is as good as telling them to shout. Evening drew its first blue line along the horizon, and the lamps lit themselves with bashful punctuality. The crystal bar woke and remembered its duties and its sins in the correct order. The pianist found a tune that did not require courage, and the lobby gained that thin sparkle that comes when people begin to think of dressing for dinner. From her window Miss Marple saw the watcher stir at last. A car had arrived with an air that could only be called suggestive, for it suggested money and secrecy and a timetable that had been negotiated rather than chosen. A woman stepped out, tall and carefully composed, and the watcher took a half-step forward and then, quite deliberately, a half-step back. He did not follow her. He turned instead and looked along the street, as if the street might produce a second figure to complete the picture. It did not. The tall woman went in under the canopy, and through the revolving door, and the lobby received her without a ripple that could be seen from above. Miss Marple watched the watcher for another minute, and then let the curtain fall. She sat at the writing desk and considered the mild deception she would employ if anyone were to ask her opinion later. Old ladies are fond of views, she would say, and no one would think to disagree. Downstairs someone laughed too loudly, and corrected himself at once. A bell rang for the second sitting in the dining room. Steps passed along the corridor and paused next door, and she heard a polite knock followed by a less polite sigh. She stirred the fire, and decided upon the fish, if there was fish, for her sea had earned the courtesy of being eaten. Before she went out, she opened the window a little wider and listened to the last steady drops from the canopy. The watcher had gone, or had stepped where she could not see him, and the entrance looked as innocent as any entrance ever does. She looked once at the door of her suite, and once at her neat little notebook. One more line joined the others, number 3, 1, 2, mentioned unprompted. Then she took up her gloves and went down to dinner, where conversation would be bright enough to cast shadows of its own, and where the truth, which is lazy until it is cornered, would perhaps allow itself to be half seen. Chapter 3. A Toast in the Crystal Bar. Evening learned its steps again, and the hotel dressed for it with quiet satisfaction. Lamps dropped soft circles on the carpet, and the mirrors along the crystal bar multiplied every light until the room seemed to breathe in glitter. The pianist chose a tune that never frightened anyone, and the barman polished the last glass as if it were a verdict. Miss Marple took a stool at the end nearest the palms and asked for a small dry sherry, which arrived with the gravity that a small dry sherry expects. She sipped and allowed her eyes to look at their reflections instead of at their subjects, which is a comfortable habit when one wishes to see everything. The man with the square shoulders came in with the air of a person who expects both welcome and room, and he received both. He set his briefcase on the brass rail and ordered brandy in a voice that carried as far as it wished to carry. He spoke of a contract that had been wrung into shape by superior force of will, and he laughed in the rusty manner of a hinge that has not been oiled. Names were not used, but sums were suggested, and failures elsewhere were described with the vigour that comes from relief. Two gentlemen who had arrived with damp collars the night before made tactful sounds and drew nearer, while the barman became very intent on his lemons. The honeymoon couple took a small table against the far mirror and arranged themselves so that their hands could touch without appearing to seek it. They looked at the menu as if it might rescue them from saying the wrong thing, and when the violinist in the corner began to play, they both forgot to be shy for a whole minute. A widow in pearls sat alone with a glass of water that looked like diamonds under the lamps. Her pearls were arranged as if they were not to be joked with, and she watched the room with a patience that did not invite interruption. From time to time her gaze touched the brandy glass of the square-shouldered man, and then moved on without comment, which is often the loudest sort of comment. The manager passed through with a look of benevolent care, and behind him glided the concierge with a ledger and a pencil that did not forgive errors. They paused by the bar rail and exchanged 3 quiet words that caused the barman to place a key beneath the counter and keep his hand near it. Miss Marple observed the movement without seeming to notice it. A bellhop drifted in at the far door with a stack of folded table cards and the solemn walk of a boy who is trying to persuade his feet to be older than he is. It was the same boy who had carried her case and the letters, and in this light he looked younger and more anxious. He glanced at the mirror and saw his own mouth pressed thin, and he corrected it, and then he saw that he had corrected it and looked smaller still. He spoke to the barman and slipped a small envelope across the wood with the gesture of a child returning a borrowed button. The barman nodded, weighed the envelope with 2 fingers, and slid it beneath the rail where the key had gone. Miss Marple took another sip and let the taste sharpen her memory of the tradesman's cart. On the wall near the entrance hung a framed notice about private dinners and the hiring of the small salon for confidential meetings. A name had been erased from a line and written again with more decision, and the ink had bloomed a little from the pressure of the pen. The square-shouldered man raised his glass and toasted the future of something that would not wait, and two men toasted him back, and one of them did not drink. People who do not drink at toasts have either made their decision already or will never make it. The widow in pearls watched that too. She lifted her water, looked into it as if it could reply, and set it down without leaving a ring. The tall woman who had arrived under the canopy at dusk came in wearing a dark suit the colour of thunder in clear weather. She passed the door, and the violinist stopped in the middle of a phrase and began another, and the barman took a glass that had been polished twice and polished it again. The manager appeared with the appropriate warmth of tone and the appropriate coolness of hand. He said that her table was ready, and the tall woman inclined her head as though the table had been a loyal servant. She did not sit, but drifted toward the corner near the service door and stood for a moment reading the framed notice about private dinners. Her lips moved very slightly, as if she were subtracting and finding the result pleasing. Miss Marple noticed that the entrance watcher had come into the bar also, not through the main door but by the short passage that led from the hall. He took a chair near the end of the counter and asked for coffee, which is a thing that disguises waiting poorly. He watched the room and then watched his spoon, which gave nothing away. The bellhop reappeared, alone now, with the thin triumph of someone who has delivered a thing that did not dare to be late. He passed a settee where the honeymooners bent their heads together and did not see him at all. He passed the pearls and received a glance that was worth more than his tip and less than his future. He came toward Miss Marple's end of the bar and stood as if he had been told to stand until breath became a nuisance. She asked him whether the sea had behaved during the afternoon, and he said that it had behaved like a gentleman who dislikes company, and he smiled despite himself. The manager put a hand on his shoulder and sent him away with a nod that looked kind and meant caution. The barman took the key from beneath the rail and vanished toward the service corridor, with the lightness of a man who has lifted something heavier than a key. When he came back, he wiped his hands on a cloth that was already clean, which told Miss Marple that the key had not been for a cupboard of lemons. The square-shouldered man had found a companion who liked the sound of profit, and the two of them arranged their voices so that anyone could overhear if they had the proper authority. Figures were rung like bells, and a reference was made to a parcel that would settle an argument when it arrived by special messenger. The widow in pearls moved her glass half an inch, and a small shadow disappeared beneath it. She asked for tea, not the bar tea, but a tray sent from the lounge, and her voice was the voice of a woman who expects and receives exactness. When the tray came, there was a silver cloche covering a small plate, placed there perhaps by habit and perhaps to keep out air and ears. The cloche was too large for the plate and made a comic dome, which is the sort of mistake no one notices if no one is looking for it. The tall woman finished her reading of notices and left the room with the inactive grace of a person measuring the steps of another. A man at the far table took out a notebook and pretended to work, which is the best way to accomplish nothing and be congratulated for it. The violinist put away his bow, and the pianist had another go at the phrase that had troubled him yesterday and did not trouble him now. Miss Marple asked for her bill and let her gaze rest on the mirror as if she were tiring of her own company. In the mirror, she saw the barman take the envelope once more and pass it to the manager, who slipped it into his inner pocket with the neatness of a practiced hand. She saw the entrance watcher finish his coffee and put 2 coins on the saucer, and then remove one and then put it back, which is as good as writing a letter about one's condition. She saw the widow in pearls lift the cloche, glance beneath, and put it down again as if she had discovered something entirely expected. A scent of orange peel lifted from the bar as the square-shouldered man ordered his 3rd brandy, not because he desired it, but because numbers obey him, and he likes them when they do. He made a remark about discretion that was not discreet, and one of the damp-collar gentlemen chose to be offended on behalf of a client who could not possibly be present. This produced a small storm, which the barman quieted with professional rain. The manager intervened at precisely the right point, and the briefcase climbed back onto its original perch with an air of innocence that fooled no one. The widow in pearls rose and took her tea to the lounge, where one may listen without being seen to listen. The honeymooners paid for 2 lemonades as if they were settling accounts on a schooner and drifted out hand in hand. The entrance watcher left by the short passage with the small jerk of a man answering to another clock than the hotel's. Miss Marple followed him as far as the hall, where the knight had begun to pat the glass politely. In the lobby, the concierge placed a key on the board and then removed it and placed it again, and the manager spoke softly to a maid who looked determined not to understand until she had to. A page ran up the stair with an expression of almost joy, which only bad news produces in boys who are not yet wicked. Miss Marple returned to her suite, for sherry produces its own sort of wakefulness, and she preferred to spend it near the sound of the sea. From the window she could see the bar lamps thinning as doors closed, and sound went elsewhere. She could see the carriage sweep and the canopy, and the far corner of the side street where shadows overlap and lean on one another for comfort. A single cab set down a passenger with a compressed silhouette and drove away without argument. The passenger did not enter by the front door, which is sometimes the mark of a careful man and sometimes the mark of a fool. She wrote in her notebook that public talk had produced private nerves, that a key had been moved when no cupboard required it, and that an envelope had migrated from bar to pocket without visiting the post. She added that the cloche in the lounge had been too large, and that the woman in pearls had pretended to be surprised by nothing. The wind lifted and then lay down. Somewhere, a door closed with courtesy and resolve. A clock in the corridor announced the hour, and then one small minute later announced it again, because the first statement had not sounded sufficiently sure of itself. Miss Marple put away the notebook and sat by the fire until the coals made their small music. She thought of the watcher who waited for a pattern, and of the tradesman's cart with its tidy tools and patient vice. She thought of the boy who delivered envelopes with the care of one who wishes to be invisible, and of the square-shouldered man pronouncing judgment upon sums as if sums were people. She let the sea do the rest of the thinking, for the sea has the advantage of never needing to be convinced. Far below, a light went on behind a blind, and then went out in the room that had been troublesome all week. It was not an event anyone would have noticed, who did not expect events to arrange themselves so. Miss Marple folded her hands and listened to the corridor where footsteps tried to become whispers and failed. Tomorrow would bring weather of one kind or another, and it would bring other things that resembled weather closely. For the present, the hotel held its breath like a choir waiting for a signal. She rang the bell for hot water and made her plans for nothing more than sleep, which is how one prepares for surprises without becoming ridiculous. Just before we continue, if you're enjoying the story so far, this quiet unraveling of secrets, consider leaving a like. It helps more mystery lovers find their way to Silent Clues, and it means a great deal to us. Now then, back to our story. Chapter 4. The Body in Room 312. Morning came with a skim of light along the cornice, and a sea that pretended to be tame. The storm had washed the windows clean, and the Grand Hotel set about washing its conscience with equal care. In the breakfast room, silver covers blinked open and shut, and toast racks marched like little gates. Miss Marple took oatmeal and a poached egg, and a view of the terrace where Puddles kept small secrets. The pianist was absent, which made the silence very present, and the manager came and went with a tempered smile that tried to reassure and succeeded only in confirming unease. A seat at the long window table remained empty despite a napkin folded like a swan. The staff glanced at it and then glanced away, which is the shyest form of gossip. After a time, the concierge stepped to the manager and murmured in a thread of voice that carried as far as it wished, and no farther. The manager nodded and looked toward the staircase, and his hands came together and parted like a man washing with air. Miss Marple finished her tea with that deliberate calm which keeps the mind from running ahead of the feet. She left the room as the second dish of bacon passed like a small ship on a serious errand. In the hall the lift waited open, and beside it stood the young bellhop with eyes that tried for ordinary and did not quite achieve it. He held a passkey on a chain and looked at it as if it were a very young serpent. The manager arrived with the measured haste of a man who intends to be seen hurrying only by the people he chooses. He greeted Miss Marple with a bow that meant respect and boundaries, and then turned to the boy. "We have had no answer to the bell," he said, "and breakfast was ordered for 8:30 and remains uneaten." The housekeeper joined them with the gravity of a person who has no time for omens and is surrounded by them. They took the lift without looking at one another, because looking would have made a promise none wished to keep. On the 3rd floor the corridor lay as still as prayer. Door plates shone, and carpets held their colours, and somewhere far off a tap decided whether to drip. They stopped at 312, which had an innocent number and an experienced air. The manager knocked. 3 polite, firm taps from a man who has opened many doors and never wanted to open one less. He waited, knocked again, and then looked to the housekeeper, who produced a ring of keys from a pocket that might have been lined with silence. The lock refused them as a matter of principle, and the boy held up the chain key with resignation. The manager used it and turned the handle slowly. The door opened with a sigh that had been waiting all night. They entered a room arranged for an occupant who had not arranged to leave. Curtains were half drawn against the pale light, and a fire had sunk to a red patience. On the small writing desk the blotter lay open like a tongue, and the pen had been laid across it as if to pin it down. Beside the desk a man sat crookedly in a chair that looked surprised to be useful. His head had fallen a little, his shoulders had given up, and one hand lay open on his knee, empty of any excuse. On the rug by the desk a glass lay on its side, and a thread of brandy crawled toward the hearth and would not reach it. There was no smell of cigar ash, yet an ashtray bore a perfect crescent of grey that had not been smudged. The window latch stood up like a little flag. On the sill lay a square of moisture that had not decided whether it was rain come in or breath gone out. The manager stopped, and his face closed carefully like a ledger. The housekeeper drew in a breath and made it behave. The boy stood quite still and went rather white around the corners. Miss Marple stepped forward and looked at the man with that grave courtesy which is owed to the living and sometimes more owed to the dead. He was the square-shouldered gentleman of the crystal bar, though his shoulders no longer argued with the air. His coat hung over the back of the chair with an exactness that suggested another hand. The knot of his tie was straight and the collar perfect, but the hair above his right ear lay crushed as if a palm had rested there without affection. The skin of his lips had taken on that faint, dry look which comes when a story has ended in the middle of a sentence. The brandy on the carpet caught the light with a small and vulgar glitter, like a joke told badly. Miss Marple looked at the glass, and then at the man's hands. There was a smear on the base of the glass where it had been set down too quickly, and there were no fresh prints on the rim. There were 2 coasters on the desk, though one was enough for a solitary nightcap, and the second lay square to the wood as if a ruler had been involved. On the hearth rug a coal stain had the shape of a heel, narrow and exact, and it pointed toward the door rather than the fire. The housekeeper crossed herself with a glance, and then remembered that the hotel liked its devotions private. The manager stooped and touched the man's wrist with a careful finger, and recoiled at once from the cold that had become the master of the room. His voice came thinly and tried to be official. "We must call the police," he said, "and the doctor, and we must do nothing until they come." "We shall do nothing unless it is something that cannot be helped," said Miss Marple, and her tone made a little room for sense in a corridor full of dread. The manager moved to the desk as if to close the blotter and thought better of it. Miss Marple looked at the blotter instead and saw that the top leaf bore no new impression, yet the sheet beneath wore a faint bruise of words pressed and torn away. She lifted the blotter a fraction and let it down again, content with the knowledge that haste had been dressed as order. On the corner of the desk, a hotel pencil had been sharpened with more force than patience. Its shavings had been removed, but a tiny curl of cedar lay in the groove of the inkwell like a secret that had slipped. On the night table a decanter of brandy stood with its stopper slightly askew. The level had fallen by a measure that hinted at calculation. There was no water glass, though a man of that man's habits had protected his throat the night before. The room spoke, and what it said was that someone had tried to make it speak a different language. A small smell of something sharp lifted and went away again, like a memory that had changed its mind. Miss Marple knelt with the quiet economy of a woman who has spent a great deal of time retrieving dropped reels of cotton. She examined the spill from the glass and the track it had made. It had been knocked over close to the desk, and then the glass had rolled an inch and stopped as if someone had nudged it into a neater lie. Spills that occur by accident have ambitions and travel. This one had behaved. She stood and looked at the window again. There was grit along the inside sill, a fine pale dust not proper to carpets or polish. It was as if a shoe had come to the window and rested a moment, deciding between looking out and going out. On the outer stone, a tiny hairline of mud lay like an underline. The manager saw where she looked and shook his head. "The windows are locked at night," he said, "and so is the service stair door, and there are no balconies." "Locks are very faithful," said Miss Marple, "until someone teaches them to be otherwise." She crossed to the wardrobe and glanced at the hangers standing at attention. A coat was missing that ought to have been there if the night had ended in sleep. On the tray by the hearth a matchbox sat very straight. The top match had been returned, head outward. People who smoke seldom put matches back that way, unless they have been interrupted and wish to seem unruffled. The bellhop swallowed and spoke very softly. "Shall I fetch Dr. Avery, sir?" he asked. "And the house phone, sir?" The manager nodded and then changed his mind and nodded again. The boy went, and the corridor caught his footsteps and ran with them. In the quiet that followed, a clock somewhere at the far end of the hall came to the hour, and then lost its courage and tried the hour again. The housekeeper pulled the curtains wider, so that the pale day would be a witness. It revealed dust on the upper moulding of the mirror frame, where a finger had traced a line and then withdrawn. On the carpet between desk and door a thread caught the light. Miss Marple bent and drew it up on a pin. It was fine and dark and had a kink in it where it had once been stitched, the sort of thread that binds pearls when pearls are real and the binding must be trusted. She placed it on the mantel, with a care that turned the mantel into a shelf of evidence. The housekeeper saw and looked at Miss Marple with gratitude she could not afford. Footsteps came quickly, and the doctor arrived with a bag that had seen all the wrong kinds of weather. He did what doctors do, and said what doctors say when the doing is too late. He looked at the brandy and did not touch it. He lifted the lid of the decanter with a fingertip and let it fall again without comment. He consulted his watch and produced a time that would make the night feel longer for everyone. The police inspector followed, a compact man with a moustache that kept secrets and boots that did not. He listened to the manager, took down a few notes with a pencil that behaved itself, and asked for no one to leave the hotel until further notice. Miss Marple stepped back into the corridor and found the boy waiting as if he had grown there. His hands were empty now, which made them conspicuous. He looked past her shoulder into the room, and then down at the carpet, where his shoes tried to become invisible. "You may fetch hot water to the small lounge," said Miss Marple kindly, "and afterwards you may tell me whether the rain found its way down the service stair last night." He looked up sharply, and then remembered to look down again. "It is a bad stair for rain, miss," he said, and his voice shook as if the stair had heard him. She nodded and let him go. The inspector began to ask questions that were broad at first, and grew narrow quickly. He lifted the glass with a fold of handkerchief and set it down with another. He noted the coasters and the ash that had not crumbled, and the window latch that had not quite decided to be fastened or free. He looked at the decanter, and then at the doctor, and did not ask the question that hovered between them. Miss Marple remained by the mantel, her hands folded as if in a pew, and allowed her mind to put the room away in drawers. In one drawer she placed the envelope she had seen last night, and the key that had moved when no cupboard required it. In another she placed the watcher under the canopy, who had entered for coffee and left when a separate clock called him. In a third she placed the widow in pearls, who looked at water as if it kept accounts. The inspector concluded the first useful round of ignorance and turned to the manager with the formality of a summons. "Who occupied 312, he asked. "And for how long, and what name sits in your ledger?" The manager said the name and the dates and the particulars in a voice that would satisfy a committee. The name had meant money last night and meant trouble now. Miss Marple listened for the sound a name makes when it touches a memory, and heard only the sea at the glass. The inspector sealed the room with field tape and took the key into his pocket with that air of possession which makes keys either honest or sulky. He asked that no one speak of the details in the hearing of guests, and then remembered that hotels are made of hearing. Miss Marple walked back toward the lift, and halfway down the corridor she paused where the carpet met the service stair door. There, a small crescent of dried mud had gathered, as if a careful heel had found its mark in the night. It was the sort of mark that a maid would remove in the morning without ever seeing, and the sort of mark that takes a murder and calls it a visit. She did not touch it. She went down to the lounge, where the palm fronds looked as if they had been listening since dawn. The widow in pearls sat with a newspaper folded to the shipping reports, and the curve of her mouth arranged not to move. The square-shouldered man's empty chair at breakfast was now an empty space in the air between conversations. Miss Marple asked for tea and was served by a waiter whose hands had been taught not to shake and were presently disobedient. She added a line to her notebook about a glass that had been too tidy in its spilling and a room that had been too industrious in its honesty. She added that the stair had collected mud and that a thread had come free of its stringing. Then she closed the notebook and drank her tea as the rain began again in a new small way against the panes. By noon, the story of a sudden illness had begun to move through the corridors, with careful feet and a hat pulled low. It would do, until the inspector chose to take off its hat and show its face. Miss Marple sat very still and let the hotel come to rest around her. She knew that the dead man had kept an appointment, and that someone else had kept a different one for him, and that the difference was the whole of it. Outside, the sea returned to its restless rehearsal, and within the hotel the day went about its duties with a respectful hush that could not last. The truth had found a room and a chair and a glass, and it would find its way to the ballroom in the end, for that is where truths prefer to dance. Chapter 5. Miss Marple notices the bellhop. The inspector had taken room 312 into his possession and left behind a hush that tried to look like order. By late afternoon the corridors recovered their appetite for footsteps, and the sea had resumed its steady practice beyond the windows. Miss Marple sat in the palm court with a cup of tea and a small plate of seed cake and watched the hotel begin to breathe again. The ladies had returned to their murmurs, and the pianist had discovered a new phrase that made even the ferns seem attentive. A boy in livery crossed the far end of the lounge with that careful lightness which boys adopt when their pockets have become too interesting. It was the same boy whose buttons shone bravely and whose eyes wished to be older than his face. As he passed, his hand went quickly to his jacket and stayed there a moment too long. Miss Marple saw the gesture as plainly as a bell against silence. She rose and drifted toward the writing table, where hotel notepaper waited for letters that hoped to be wiser than their writers. The boy had stopped near the service door and was looking at the floor in the manner of someone rehearsing honesty. A small dark smudge showed at the edge of his pocket, the colour of sealing wax when it has been pressed in a hurry. Miss Marple admired the flowers with great attention, and then addressed him in a tone that appreciated boys and did not expect them to be men. "I wonder," she said, "whether you could advise me on the best hour to post a letter, since storms do mislead the post." He looked up quickly, saw a harmless elderly lady, and was disarmed by the very thing he had hoped for. "Best to give it to the night porter, miss," he said, and then added, with sudden caution, that the post leaves early if the wind is wrong. "Thank you," said Miss Marple, and her eyes rested for the briefest moment on his pocket. He felt the glance like a touch, and flushed. She produced a folded handkerchief and laid it on the table with deliberation. "There is a spot of blue on your cuff," she said, and if you use the wrong soap it will fix." He looked and then looked away, because boys do not like to see evidence unless it belongs to someone else. "My aunt used to keep blue for whites," Miss said, he murmured. "Indeed," said Miss Marple, "and sometimes gentlemen keep blue for letters." The boy's eyes flickered to the service door and back again. A shadow crossed the lounge as the widow in pearls went by without turning her head. Miss Marple touched the handkerchief with a finger. "Do sit a moment," she said, as if she were granting a favour rather than asking one. The boy obeyed because the chair had been waiting for him all day. On his breast the small enamel badge gave his name as George, and the enamel had lost a corner as if the name had been argued with. "You were on duty late last night, I think," said Miss Marple, "and I hope they let you sleep a little after." George swallowed and nodded. "There was a message to carry, miss," he said, and the porter could not leave his desk. "So late," said Miss Marple gently. "Nearly midnight," he said, and then bit his lip, for midnight is a word that belongs to police when there has been trouble. Her voice made a small harbour of calm. "It is a sensible hour for people who like to avoid crowds," she observed. "Did you find your gentleman easily?" George shook his head, and then remembered to speak. "He found me, miss," he said, and his voice dropped. "He asked if a note had come for him, and when I said no, he said there would be, and not to keep it more than a minute when it did." "And did it come?" asked Miss Marple. George looked at his fingers, as if they could answer for him. "Yes, miss," he said, and his mouth went thin again. "It was sealed, and had letters on it, and a mark in blue. I was to take it straight to room 312 and put it in the gentleman's own hand, and I was not to knock twice." Miss Marple poured a little more tea, which is the best reward for truth when truth is young. "Did you do as you were told?" she asked. "I did, miss," he said. He opened the door a little and took it without showing his face, and I saw his cuff and the corner of his hand and smelt something like oranges, and he said "thank you" in a way that meant I was to go at once. There was a pause, and the boy's hand returned to his pocket as if pocket and hand could defend one another. Miss Marple waited. Waiting is a kindness when secrets are breaking their own hearts to be told. George drew out a small scrap and placed it on the table as if it might burn through the wood. It was the torn stub of a wax seal, flattened to a thin blue leaf, with the ghost of an initial pressed into it. "I was to burn the paper that covered it, miss," he whispered, "but the blue stuck under my nail, and I could not leave it in the grate in case it showed in the ash. So I put it by, and then I could not think what to do." Miss Marple looked at the fragment with interest and gratitude. She did not touch it. "Letters pressed into wax have ways of surviving their masters," she said. "Can you tell me the letters you saw?" George frowned with the effort of being exact. "I think there were two," he said. "The first like a loop and a line, and the second like a gate with a bar." Miss Marple considered the alphabet of motives and said nothing. "And you delivered this at midnight?" she asked. "A little before the clock, miss," he said. "I know, because I heard the lift when I came back, and the clock had not yet struck. I saw the manager in the corridor, and he said I should not be up so late unless I meant to grow into a porter at once, and I said yes, sir, and went down the service stair." Miss Marple's eyes rested on his face with all the comfort a tidy kitchen gives. "Did you see anyone on the stair?" she asked. "Only a draught, miss," he said, "and a sound like a heel that did not want to make a sound. But it may have been a pipe." "And after?" asked Miss Marple. "After, I took a tray to the small lounge for the lady with pearls," he said, "and she thanked me without looking and asked for the cloche to be left on the plate to keep a dish from cooling. Then I went to the hall, and the night porter sent me with a rug to the door, because the wind lifts the edge and makes a noise." Miss Marple nodded and allowed the sea to fill the silence for a moment. "You have done nothing wrong, George," she said. "You did what you were told, and no more, which is as much as can be asked of anyone at your age." George's eyes shone at the relief, and then clouded again at the memory of the room on the third floor. "I never thought," he said, and stopped. Miss Marple folded her hands and arranged her thoughts as one arranges cutlery. "There is one thing more," she said in the tone of someone inquiring about milk deliveries. "The gentleman in room 312. Did he send you with any message to another room?" George hesitated and then shook his head. "No, miss," he said, "but there was a card on the desk with a name on it, and it had been pushed under the blotter as if it were shy. I saw only the end of it, and the letters looked like the name of a ship." "That is often the way with names," said Miss Marple. "They pretend to be places when they are people, and people when they are places." She pushed the handkerchief gently toward him. "Take this," she said. "If the inspector asks you about Blue, you may show him the truth cleanly. Tell him that you delivered a sealed envelope to room 312 shortly before midnight, and that you kept a fragment because it was stuck to you. You need not say to whom the letters belonged, unless he asks, and you are sure." George nodded, relief and dread wrestling politely on his face. He rose, thanked her with awkward gratitude, and slipped away through the service door with the air of a boy who has gained a year and lost a little sleep. Miss Marple sat for a time and reviewed the small procession of facts. An envelope with blue seal and initials had been delivered at an hour when secrets take off their shoes. A boy had been told not to knock twice, and had been answered by a hand rather than a face. A scent of orange had hovered in a doorway where brandy would later lie. A stair had cupped a careful step, and a cloche had sat like a dome over an ordinary plate. She left the palm court and made a little detour that took her through the corridor by the service stairs. There the air held a thread of chill and the smell of carbolic that hotels summon when they wish to wash away memory. On the second tread, a tiny fleck of blue clung to the varnish like a star lost from its sky. She did not touch it. At the end of the passage, a narrow window showed a slice of yard and a corner of the tradesman's turning. A cart stood there briefly, with its horse nosing the bit and its tailboard down. A man in a cap moved about with the snug economy of someone who has brought exactly what was ordered and nothing besides. His hands were quick, and his eyes were quicker. A moment later, the tailboard went up and the cart rolled away, and the yard resumed its habit of being ignored. Miss Marple returned to the lounge and asked for the smallest possible glass of water. She sipped and allowed the hotel to pass by her like a polite review. The manager paused to speak to a guest, and his voice was a thread that would not quite hold. The widow in pearls sat by the window with a newspaper folded to the advertisements and a gaze that had tied itself in a neat knot. The honeymooners compared postcards with the delight of children who have been given the right to be childish. The inspector entered from the hall, and the air around him became practical. He saw Miss Marple and came over with a nod that had already learned to respect her silence. "You have been comfortable, madam?" he asked, and he meant, "Have you seen anything?" "I have had a good deal of tea," said Miss Marple, "which improves both comfort and vision. I wonder whether you would like to know what a boy told me when I asked him not to lie to himself." The inspector sat, and Miss Marple told him about the envelope and the blue and the instruction to knock once. She told him about the scent and the hour and the fragment that did not burn. She did not tell him about the fleck on the stair, because some things are better found by policemen who cherish discovery, and this inspector looked likely to cherish it. He thanked her gravely and said that messages are often more dangerous than the things they announce. He asked the name on the boy's badge and wrote it down in a notebook that respected names. When he had gone, Miss Marple sat a little longer and listened to the piano, remembering how to sing. Then she went up to her suite and stood at the window where the sea shook out its hems. Below, the entrance canopy gathered the last of the afternoon light, and under it the watcher of yesterday reappeared and pretended to yawn. He looked up and down the street, as if summoning a companion who kept changing her mind. He did not come in. The day thinned toward evening, and the lamps drew breath. Miss Marple opened her notebook and wrote 4 lines that made a small ladder for thought. First line, a sealed envelope at midnight delivered by a boy with a badge. Second line, a scent of orange where brandy would later be found. Third line, blue on a stair and blue on a cuff. Fourth line, A lady who asked for a cloche to cover nothing important. She put down her pencil and looked out at the sea again, which never pretends innocence for long. Somewhere behind the walls a key turned with a tiny courteous click. The sound belonged to a door that had never been issued, 2 keys, and Miss Marple thought about the tradesman's cart and the patience of vices and the speed of quick hands. Night would bring the next piece, as nights do when hotels hold their breath and wait. Chapter 6. The Key That Shouldn't Exist. Rain returned in a thoughtful drizzle that made the pavements look newly invented. By mid-morning, the hotel had found a tone that suggested routine and hoped to be believed. Miss Marple drank her tea and counted small certainties, which is the proper prelude to large surprises. The inspector came to her table with a look that had mislaid its patience and found its determination. He placed a square of felt on the table, as if it were a stage, and set down 2 keys upon it with the ceremony of a card trick he did not enjoy. Both were stamped 312 on their brass tags. Only one of them should have been breathing. "We have a problem of arithmetic, madam," he said, and his voice made apology for the arithmetic rather than the problem. "The manager assures me that exactly 1 key to room 312 left the board yesterday and did not return until this morning. This one here is his key, and its tag and ring are of a piece with the others. The second was found behind a radiator in the service corridor, wrapped in a napkin. It is not hotel issue." Miss Marple looked at them without touching. One tag had a proper bevel, and a number cleanly cut by a hand that knew the rest of the board by heart. The other wore its number 2 deep and a trifle crooked, and the hole for the ring showed no history of being turned by many days. Along the stem the faintest rasping told of a file, used hastily and then caressed with oil. There was the tenderest ghost of blue in a crease near the tag, as if a seal had brushed it and regretted the intimacy. She let the quiet stand. "Locks are like parishioners," she said at last. "They do very well on Sundays until someone teaches them an easier creed." The inspector allowed himself the smallest twitch of a smile and put the keys back in their new felt pew. "We will ask every tradesman who crossed that yard," he said. "The manager has provided a list of deliveries and services. One cart in particular interests me, since it carried a small vice and the sort of box that wakes when keys are mentioned." Miss Marple remembered the tailboard and the neat tools and the polite little jaws of the vice. She had seen such boxes visited in side streets near haberdashers, where widowers wanted new cupboard locks and shop girls wanted new hopes. She saw again the cart rolling into shadow beneath the service arch, and the horse flicking an ear as if it had heard a number whispered. They went together to the hall, where the keyboard hung like a regiment. The manager stood before it with an expression of immaculate concern and a pencil sharpened within an inch of martyrdom. The concierge kept the ledger open at yesterday and the day before, and the columns had the air of wanting to be more honest than they were permitted to be. The inspector asked for the times of removal and return for 312, and received them with elegant promptness. The entries were neat enough, but the pencil had darkened 1 hour more than habit suggested, and the rubber crumbs that follow amendment had been brushed away without achieving invisibility. Miss Marple studied the board as if it were a sampler. She saw that the tag for 312 sat a little prouder in its slot than its neighbours, as if it had recently been congratulated. She observed a pale crescent on the wood beneath it, where a ring had swung with more energy than the day required. She looked at the spare keys that hung for the linen cupboards and the service doors, and noted that one hook was empty and its label tucked back, a trifling disorder in a place where trifles were ironed. The manager provided explanations that would have satisfied a bishop and a barmaid. He described an alarm bell that had taken a fancy to ring, and a window latch that had sulked, and he described his own diligence as though it were a collective noun. Miss Marple smiled, and let him be excellent. In the courtyard, the drizzle beaded the cobbles and made a necklace of the drain chain. She stepped close to the stone beneath the service window, and saw 2 bright points like tiny stars fallen into daylight. They were brass filings, small as flour, and not from any hinge. She touched one to the tip of a pin, and it clung politely, as new filings will when oil still remembers them. A smell of machine oil lay quiet under the laundry soap and the coal. On the sill itself, a faint arc had been traced by something that had pivoted with care. It was the sort of mark a new key makes when a cautious hand tests the fit and does not quite trust its courage. At the yard's mouth, a boy fetched coal, and when asked about yesterday's visitors, he enumerated them with the relish of a witness who has been longing to be useful. There was fish and bread and beer, and someone with glass, he said. There was a man who fixes things, who came twice, and whistled like he knew the tune and did not care to finish it. He had a box like a lunch tin, but heavier. The inspector made a note that looked as if it meant to travel. They returned by the service stair, and Miss Marple paused on the second tread, where the fleck of blue still clung like a loyalty. She left it for the inspector to see with his own contentment, and he did, and his moustache considered it and agreed. In the small lounge, the widow in pearls sat with a book that did not need a reader. Her pearls held their lesson perfectly, and her hands were as still as an answer she had practiced. She looked up when they entered, and her gaze flicked in the direction of the mantel where, last night, a silver cloche had rested. Miss Marple's thoughts touched the thread she had lifted from the hearthrug in 312, dark and fine with a kink like a memory. Her eyes dropped to the widow's clasp, where the string met its tiny gold tongue and then rose with the politeness that notices and forgives. The inspector asked if she had been disturbed by any unusual noise, and she said in tones of great moderation that the sea had been quite industrious, and that one cannot fault the ocean for being itself. He thanked her and did not overstay his welcome. In the crystal bar, the barman stood as a man stands who has been told to be both honest and ornamental. Under the counter, the gap where a key had slept the previous evening was empty and very clean. A napkin drawer showed a space where one napkin of a certain plainness had been, and the barman supplied a credible history for its absence that ended in the laundry and meant nothing at all. Miss Marple saw, near the rail, the small grey pearl of a match head that had been rubbed and then thought better of itself. Orange peel had been used that day for a decoration, and the scar of it coloured the air. The inspector gathered the staff at the foot of the stair for a word that was both caution and comfort. He announced that a duplicate key had been found, and that anyone who had knowledge of its making would be wise to exchange that knowledge for brevity of trouble. No one chose wisdom aloud. George the bellhop stood just within hearing, his badge secure and his gaze fixed on the banister where knots in the wood made faces for frightened boys to look at. Miss Marple asked him in a conversational tone whether he had ever seen the tradesman's cart in the yard after dusk, and he said, "Only last night when it ought not," and then shut his mouth as if he had said too much. The inspector let the silence do the questioning, and then dismissed them to their useful occupations. Toward 3 o'clock, the tall woman who had arrived at dusk on the previous day presented herself at the desk with a request for a private dining room at 7. She spoke to the manager with the courteous exactitude of a person who has always paid for silence and found it good value. Her gloves lay on the counter a moment too long, and when she took them up, there was a pale crescent upon the wood, the tint of fine rouge. Miss Marple watched her go and noted the way she turned her head toward the service passage and then away, as a person does when she is checking a clock that does not belong to her. The inspector returned with a little victory. The locksmith who had whistled like a man unwilling to finish his tune had been found at his midday bread. He had opinions about the innocence of keys and the guilt of people, and he had a scrap of paper in his pocket with the number 312 written twice and then scratched out and written again. He maintained, with the pride of the small hired, that he had come to see about a jammed cupboard in the linen store, and he had been paid in ready coin by a lady whose face he could not remember, except that it wore calm like a veil. He could, however, remember the glove she wore on her right hand, for it had a tear at the forefinger stitched neatly across. Miss Marple sat back and allowed the picture to make itself. A lady with calm and a stitched glove, and a desire for a private room at 7 who had read the notice about confidential dinners with interest, and who did not care for clumsy match heads. A widow with pearls whose string had given a single hair to the hearthrug where a man had sat down to die. A barman with an empty place under his counter and the memory of a key that had slept there for a moment and then been woken. A manager with an excellent pencil and a ledger that had decided to be a little darker in one place. She went up to her suite for her knitting and stood once more at the window that made the street a stage. Under the canopy the watcher of earlier days had taken up his weatherproof post again, hat low, hands unoccupied, gaze exact. He was not waiting for a face, she thought, but for a motion, for the neat relay that tells a pattern it may begin. A van stopped by the arch, and a boy unloaded baskets, and went at once to the service door without looking at the hall. 2 minutes later, a small parcel passed from a hand in black to a hand in white, and disappeared toward the kitchen, with a speed that meant urgency and innocence in equal parts. At 6, the rain drew back like a curtain, and the hotel lights stepped forward. Miss Marple put down her knitting, and made a small list in her book, the better to keep the head from racing. She wrote that a key had been born in a yard, and hidden where heat and pipes would disguise its existence. She wrote that the key had been paid for by a calm hand in a stitched glove, and that the number it carried had been learned from a board that should have been less generous with its face. She wrote that the man who died had poured brandy and not water, and that orange had scented a corridor at midnight. She wrote that people who plan well still leave a thread behind, and a fleck on a stair and a crescent on wood. When she closed the book, she felt the calm that comes when a piece finds its place, and another piece begins to complain about being left out. Downstairs, the manager rehearsed hospitality for 7 o'clock in the small salon, and the barman sat by a cloche as if by instinct. The widow in pearls looked at a telegram with a face arranged not to move, and then folded it very small. George hovered by the lift, awaiting a bell that had already decided to ring. The inspector stood where he could see the lobby and the service passage at once, and tapped the felt square in his pocket to make sure his arithmetic still added up to 2. Miss Marple smoothed her gloves, not because she expected to go out into the rain, but because some evenings require readiness as respectable as church. It seemed to her that the hotel had ceased to hope for ordinary weather, and had begun to hope for the truth, which is a more draughty prospect and a better one. The key that should not exist lay now in a policeman's pocket, and yet its mischief went on, because doors opened yesterday will go on opening in people's minds until someone shows them where they truly lead. Chapter 7. Gossip in the Palm Court. Afternoon sunlight drifted through the high glass of the Palm Court and made lace upon the tablecloths. The pianist attempted bravery and settled for charm, and the palms rustled as if they approved of secrets told in a low voice. Miss Marple took the corner chair that overlooked the room and asked for Darjeeling and thin slices of lemon, which arrived with a plate of small cakes that pretended to innocence. Society had already arranged itself in comfortable rings, each ring with its own temperature and its own weather. Conversation flowed in little currents that met and parted, and carried with them the leaves of names. On the nearest sofa, 2 ladies who wore their pearls as one wears a verdict exchanged news. One had a fox stole folded like a decision, the other had a lorgnette that never reached her eyes. They spoke of the storm, then of the trains, and then at once of the man who had failed to keep his breakfast. "Such a pity, when a gentleman is taken ill away from home," said the first, and her tone suggested that distance made illness untidy. "I hear he was not so much taken as delivered," said the second, and her lorgnette glanced toward the ceiling as if the ceiling might confirm it. A third lady joined them, smooth as cream, and set down a teacup that wanted to tremble. She spoke of a private salon booked for 7, and of a lady who had arrived with calm, stitched into her gloves, and a look that could order silence as neatly as a tart. "Calm is always suspicious in a hotel," said the first, "unless it belongs to a maid." They lowered their voices and raised their interest. "It is said that our unfortunate businessman was in funds yesterday," said the second, and even more in confidence, and that he spoke about a parcel which would make a matter plain. "Parcels are indiscreet," said the third, "and gentlemen who promise parcels are worse." From the far table came a burst of soft laughter, and the sound brought with it another current of talk. A pair of sisters who had lived too long in the shadow of a retired colonel discussed the widow in pearls. They remembered a charity garden party where those pearls had been admired by the vicar's wife and resented by a banker's daughter. They remembered that the widow had once been photographed on a yacht, and that the man who has now been taken ill had done business with a company that floated on paper and then learned to sink. "Floating is agreeable until it happens to money," said one sister, and the other nodded as if she had always suspected water of bad intentions. Miss Marple sipped her tea and tasted lemon and memory. She let the currents pass by and listened for the stones that turned them. At the next table a young woman with well-arranged hair said with an air of generosity that one must not condemn grief that has learned to dress very well. "If I had been widowed with those pearls I should have grieved like an anthem," she said, and her companion murmured that anthems are sometimes timed to coincide with legacies. A gentleman with a newspaper folded at the share prices remarked to no one that our deceased had once underwritten a venture which made loud promises and paid in whispers. He murmured the name of a coastal syndicate and a shipment that never quite left the dock. The ladies heard without listening and later repeated without remembering the source. Miss Marple's eye moved to the door where George the bellhop passed with an empty tray and a face that had learned to keep time with the piano. He glanced quickly at the lounge clock, and then at the service passage, and then at his shoes, which told the truth when no one else dared. Across the room, the widow in pearls sat at a table for one and read a telegram that had been folded and unfolded until it looked like a small history. Her mouth did not move and her hands were perfectly still on the paper. When she lifted her cup, she used her left hand and allowed the pearls to settle, and the tiny gold tongue of the clasp sat at the hollow of her neck as if it had been given an order. A pair of hotel regulars, the sort of ladies who attend concerts avidly and remember the solos, took up a position by the palms and set the afternoon to rights. They had names for everyone and details for most, and they stitched those details into a pattern now. "The tall woman who asked for the private salon is not new to hotels," said one with certainty. "She knows where the notice is kept and how to read a ledger without seeing it. There is a reason she arrived at dusk and not at noon. Her friend said that the reason wore a square shoulder yesterday and now sits terribly still. The pianist played a little run that sounded like a whisper going upstairs. A maid brought more hot water and retreated with the speed of someone who has not yet learned that haste is the only scandal a maid may afford. A gentleman from the writing table spoke to the manager about a locked valise and was assured that the hotel would die rather than permit a theft. He then remarked that he had seen a locksmith about the place and that he disliked artisans who whistle when keys are mentioned. The manager made a note and gave nothing away. Miss Marple's tea cooled, and she did not mind. The ladies near the palms returned to the widow and her past. They said that before she was a widow she had been a wife, which is the sort of history that many share, and that her husband had been less careful with his friends than with his cigar ash. They said that the dead man of room 312 had quarrelled with her in the reading room 2 nights ago, not in words one could hear, but in silences one could not bear, and that she had left a minute before he did, and that her pearls had been very white indeed. They said that a boy had taken tea to her at midnight, and that the cloche had been kept over the plate after the tray left the room, which is something people might do when they wish to hide a note that was late. An elderly gentleman in a chair by the palm observed the entrance canopy the way naturalists observe nests. He claimed an acquaintance with the watcher who had sheltered there, and said that such men are employed to deliver and to witness and to keep accounts in a sort of ledger that must never be produced. He believed that the watcher was not a constable, for constables do not choose coffee when there is beer, but that he had the habit of law about him, and the habit of patience also. The colonel's sisters concluded that the deceased had made the sort of enemies that money makes when it is less polite than it ought to be. They thought of a mistress, because society always finds one when there is an empty chair at dinner. They did not agree about whether the mistress would be tall and calm or small and quick, but they agreed that the matter would have been arranged in a private room at 7 in the evening if the sea had not interfered. Miss Marple asked for more hot water and watched the steam write gentle warnings on the air. She considered the narrow heel she had seen outlined on the hearthrug, and the fleck of blue that clung to a stair, and the thread that had caught the light between desk and door. She considered a decanter that had fallen by a measure, and a glass that had obeyed orders, and a latch that had dithered between fast and free. The manager came through with a face that described calm and hands that denied it. He spoke to the concierge in a voice that threaded past the tables without snaring a single ear, and the concierge wrote something on a small slip and folded it and did not send it anywhere. The tall woman entered with a hat that did not beg to be noticed, and gloves that told their own quiet tale at the forefinger. She crossed the room and looked for a seat that would allow her to see the door and be seen by as few as possible, which is a plan easily made and rarely achieved in a hotel at tea. The ladies near the palms identified her without agreement and explained her without knowledge. One had it that she was the victim of a promise, another that she was the author of it, and the third that she was neither and preferred to be seen as both. Miss Marple watched her pour tea as if measuring something, and saw the tiniest tremor at the first touch of the cup to the saucer, not the tremor of guilt, but the tremor of someone who has allowed herself a single mistake today and will not allow another. The inspector came and stood at the far door and did not enter, which is sometimes a louder statement than arrival. He saw Miss Marple and inclined his head and looked toward the small salon where preparations made their orderly noises. A maid with a folded napkin passed him a glance that had learned to be neutral and almost succeeded. The society rings continued to revolve very gently, and their orbits now included the words midnight and envelope and key. Those words appeared and disappeared like 3 little boats moving between tables. Miss Marple had heard enough boats launch to know when a tide was lifting them. She folded her napkin and rose and drifted past the ladies in a way that invited them to speak more and believe it less. They obliged, as talkers do when they meet a listener who makes room for their cleverness. She heard that the deceased had a habit of promising settlements that matured at midnight, and that he had a fondness for orange in his glass and in his buttonhole, and that a scent of it had trailed him like a flag in a corridor where the sea could not follow. She heard that the widow had been seen on the terrace at a time when a lady in pearls would have avoided dew, and that she had spoken to the manager about the safe deposit with a tone that did not invite delay. She heard that a gentleman from the docks had expressed himself strongly about a contract that had altered its terms without reading them aloud, and that he had booked a room under a name that belonged on ships rather than on letters to a mother. When she had heard the last of it, which was only the next of it in a light address, she returned to her seat and finished the lemon in her cup. She wrote 3 lines in her notebook and let the pencil rest. First line: the widow and the dead man quarrelled in silence that could be heard. Second line: a private salon at 7 invites an appointment that prefers midnight. Third line: orange and blue are colours that have no business together unless someone intends to be remembered. The pianist played 2 notes that meant the hour was moving, and the room felt for a second like a stage waiting for its cue. Miss Marple saw George cross to the side door with a letter held as if it might explode and disappear at once. She saw the tall woman glance at the clock, and then at the corridor to the service stair, and then at the door of the small salon, which had been dressed for company and looked almost honest. The widow in pearls folded her telegram into a fold that could not be folded further, and stood and went away without haste. The rings of conversation broke and reformed around her absence, as water closes over a stone thrown well. Miss Marple rose too, and took her hat and gloves with that tidy efficiency which says a day has made up its mind. Gossip had done its work, which is to point at the truth without touching it. The rest would require soles on carpet and eyes on hinges, and a willingness to let people reveal themselves in the order they had planned and then in the order they had not. Outside the glass, the sea lay with the patience of something that knows it will always have the last word. Inside, the hotel polished its silver for 7 o'clock and told itself that nothing important would happen after that hour. Miss Marple did not contradict it. She went to dress for dinner with a mind that had stopped collecting and started arranging. Arranging is the last step before knowing, and knowing is never as tidy as arranging. Just before we continue, if you're enjoying the story so far, this quiet unraveling of secrets, consider leaving a like. It helps more mystery lovers find their way to Silent Clues, and it means a great deal to us. Now then, back to our story. Chapter 8. The Note Under the Silver Cloche. The dining room performed its evening ritual with the solemn cheer of a ship launching into a narrow tide. Lamps wore shades like small moons, and the glass chimed in tiny, polite collisions that meant appetite had remembered its manners. Miss Marple took a modest table near the service station, which is the best place to observe industry without becoming part of it. There a sideboard stood with its ranks of plates and the tall silver cloche that hotels keep as much for ceremony as for heat. The cloche covered a single small dish set by itself, as if it had been put aside for an appetite that had not arrived. A waiter brushed past with a decanter, and the soft suspicion of orange in the air reminded her of a corridor at midnight. The widow in pearls entered in grey silk, and took a table by the pillar where a mirror offered discretion and reflection in equal measure. The tall woman chose a place that gave her a good view of the door to the small salon. The manager moved among the tables with an air of benevolence that had learned to carry messages. George the bellhop hovered by the door, enlisted for the night as an assistant to the head waiter, and trying to keep his new importance from showing in his feet. Miss Marple asked for the fish and a cup of weak tea, and was pleased to be told that both could be arranged. Between courses, the cloche remained at attention beside the service station, bright as a bell that had misplaced its rope. A draught pressed along the carpet from the hall, and raised the corner of a napkin so that a scrap of paper showed beneath the cloche for the briefest instant. It was the smallest of confessions, and then it hid again. Miss Marple dabbed her mouth and set down her napkin, and stood in the amiable fuss that follows a course when no one is certain whether to be grateful or hungry still. She drifted to the flowers on the sideboard and admired them as if lilies could repay attention. Her hand settled on the cloche and lifted it with a steadiness learned long ago over tea trays in drawing rooms where nerves were expected to be excellent. Under the cloche lay a folded note, its edges roughened by haste, its corner bruised by a thumb that had meant to be careful and failed. Ink had smudged along 2 initials so that each letter wore a shadow, and the downstroke of the first was a looped stroke, while the second showed 2 uprights joined by a firm bar. The message itself had been written with the curt piety of people who worship arrangements. It said that a meeting would be kept at midnight in 312. The last word had been underlined twice, and the second line had trembled. Miss Marple did not touch the paper. She leaned a fraction to look, and in leaning she saw that the flower water had left a pale ring on the wood, and that a drop had fallen upon the cloche, and dried there in a shape very like a tear. She let the cloche fall back into its place and returned to her seat with a contented ignorance that invited no comment. The inspector arrived a minute later, as if summoned by the clatter of thoughts rather than cutlery. He paused at the door, took in the tables, and came to Miss Marple, as a man goes to a map when the weather changes. "If you have a moment," she said in a voice that could have been inquiring about salt, "there is a trifle under a cover that is not a sauce." They walked to the sideboard together, Miss Marple with the mild air of a woman seeking more bread, the inspector with the neutrality of a gentleman admiring the silver. She lifted the cloche, and he bent slightly, and his hand hovered and did not touch. Then he took out a clean envelope from his pocket and slid the note into it with the clean competence of someone who has been taught to step over trouble rather than into it. The manager approached in a hurry hidden inside a stroll. The inspector spoke low and enough. "Whose dish was set aside?" he asked. The manager produced 3 possibilities with the ease of a man who believes in spare explanations. A late arrival had sent down for eggs. A gentleman in the lounge had ordered soup and then gone to smoke. The small salon had asked for an extra tray in case a guest wished for privacy with dessert. Miss Marple looked from the cloche to the pillar, and then to the mirror where Pearls took a breath and settled. The widow in pearls was watching nothing and everything, the way people watch when they have been told to wait. The tall woman let her spoon circle her soup, as if she were drawing a plan upon a small pond. George stood by the swing door as if it were a clock, and he its second hand. The inspector asked for the dish to be carried to the pantry, and for no one to disturb the cover again. He put the fresh envelope into his pocket with the same motion a conjurer uses to make a coin disappear. Dinner went on with that peculiar cheerfulness that takes hold of rooms where something has been prevented from happening on time. The violinist came in from the crystal bar and played a tune that pretended not to know what walls hear. The fish was very good. Miss Marple ate with the respect one owes to kitchens and thought about hands. Someone's hand had folded the note and had chosen to hide it in a place where a servant might carry it unwittingly, a place to be lifted in the course of duty, a place that invited discovery by precisely the person meant to discover it. There are traps and there are announcements, and this had been an announcement disguised as a trap. She thought of the bruise on the corner of the paper, and of the tremor of the underline, and of the looped first initial, and the gate like second. George passed her table with a jug, and she asked him whether the cloche had been placed for the small salon. He swallowed, and said that it had stood there since before the second sitting, and that the head waiter had told him to let it be. He had seen a note go under it, yes, and the man who put it there wore gloves, and the gloves had the sort of stitched tear that people make neat because it cannot be repaired without acknowledgement. He thought the glove belonged to a lady he had seen reading a notice last night and speaking very softly about a private table. Miss Marple thanked him with that tiny lift of the eye that tells a boy he has been useful and will not be punished for it. At 7, the doors of the small salon closed, quiet as petals, and the manager took post outside with the gravity of a doorman at a club that admits only trouble. The tall woman did not go in at once. She drifted to the telephone box and spoke so quietly that the box had to bend to listen. When she emerged, her face had been arranged into a serenity that was too symmetrical to last. The widow finished her fish and asked for tea and lemon. Her pearls lay in a tranquil arc on her collarbone, the clasped tongue shining like a small gold threat. Miss Marple saw the inspector speak to the head waiter and then to the barman and then to the night porter, and with each inquiry a thread that had been pulled tidy yesterday frayed a little today. The cloche had moved from the sideboard to the pantry, yet the idea of it remained in the room, like a bell still ringing though no one touched it. Dessert arrived, and the violinist played something with a little more heart in it. Miss Marple declined pudding and asked for the plainest biscuit, which is a good companion when thought is being fitted to action. From the pantry a murmur arose and died as quickly as candles when a door is closed. The inspector returned, and his expression suggested that the note had offered him more than politeness. He asked the manager for the list of guests who had eaten in the small salon in the last week, and for the names of staff whose hands had regular business with its door. The names were produced and were too many by half. A hotel is a public machine that pretends to be private and requires a crowd to do it. Miss Marple rose and took a turn through the hall. The entrance canopy was wet again, and under it the watcher had returned to his post as if the rain could be counted upon to hire him. He glanced at a pocket watch, and then at the revolving door, and then at the street where the sea's breath rode the fog. When Miss Marple came back past the service passage, a tray stood there with a cloche of its own, smaller and honest, and beside it a napkin on which an oval of damp had formed in the shape of a ring. In the oval was the faintest crescent of blue, a tiny print where a seal had once come to rest. She did not touch it. She returned to the dining room and took her chair, and the biscuit she had not eaten, and considered the business of initials. A looped first letter might be the beginning of a name that had been overheard often enough to acquire ownership. An H for a household familiar with pearls. A, G for a gentleman whose boy had carried envelopes with care. An R for a company that had floated and sunk and left its paper swollen with salt. She set aside the alphabet and kept the hour. Midnight had been written with confidence and underlined with care, which meant that someone had wished the time to be remembered after the fact. The violinist packed away his music, and the ladies from the palm court drifted to the lounge where coffee makes gossip reasonable. The tall woman went in at last to the small salon, and the door closed behind her with a courtesy that did not promise kindness. The widow in pearls remained, her gaze lowered to her cup, as if tea leaves could prefer one future to another. The inspector took up a position that allowed him to see both women without admitting that he watched either. Miss Marple's bill arrived, and she paid it with the satisfaction of someone whose arithmetic and the inspector's arithmetic had agreed for the first time that day. She walked to the lounge and found a chair that gave her a square of the ballroom door to look at. The chandelier had been polished until it thought well of itself. The floor shone with the vanity of wood that has performed often and knows the steps. On a side table, a second cloche stood guard over a plate of sugared almonds, and beneath it a shadow suggested nothing at all. She sat, folded her hands, and listened to the minute hand edge toward the time the note had favoured. The hotel changed key as the evening lengthened. Voices dropped and carpets thickened, and the sea shut out beyond the glass began to beat a soft drum that steady nerves find good for thinking. A boy ran up the stair with a telegram for the manager and returned with empty hands and relief. The manager read the message and closed it carefully into a pocket, as if the words might fly and stick to the ceiling. The inspector came once more to Miss Marple and stood as a man stands who is considering a choice between two doors. He asked, very quietly, whether the first initial had been looped. She said it had. He asked whether the second had been a gate with a bar. She said it had. He nodded and looked not at the widow and not at the small salon, but at the path between them which a sensible person might pretend not to notice. "There is one thing I have always found, miss," she said, and she smiled a little, not to encourage him but to help the thought along. When a note chooses to be found, it means to warn as well as to invite. A warning is a sort of kindness when the writer expects to be present at the result. If the writer does not appear, the kindness belongs to someone else. The inspector went away without answering, and Miss Marple returned her attention to the almond cloche until the shadow beneath it convinced her it was only sweets. From the small salon a bell tinkled once and then again, the sound an elegant plea for a fresh jug of hot water. George went and returned, and said nothing, and kept a face that meant everything. The hour moved, and the dining-room grew thin, and the bar grew quiet, and the night outside took a firmer hold on the glass. Miss Marple rose and crossed to the window and looked down at the canopy. The watcher had gone, or had stepped back into some other employment darkness allows. On the whetstone a narrow heel had printed a delicate witness, and beside it a broader sole had obliterated its companion and left a smear pointing toward the service arch. She looked away before her own reflection caught her in the act of thinking. In her room she wrote the lines that had demanded to be written since the cloche was lifted. She wrote that a note had been hidden where it would be found, that it had named an hour and a room, that its initials wore ink like a mask, that its underline trembled, that its corner was bruised. She wrote that people who plan murder with care either hate improvisation or require it more than most. She wrote that kindness can be employed as bait, and that blue cares to leave traces on the least hospitable surfaces. Then she put away the notebook and listened to the hall where footsteps resolved themselves into pairs and then into single steps that hurried and then pretended not to have hurried. Midnight was no longer far. The hotel counted toward it very politely. So did Miss Marple, though her arithmetic was not the arithmetic of clocks. Chapter 9. Footprints to the service stair. Night sank softly and left its aftertaste on the carpets, and by morning a pale clarity had crept into the passages like forgiveness that had not made up its mind. Miss Marple went early to the corridor above the palm court, the one that gave onto the back passage where trays pass as quietly as regrets. She walked with a cotton handkerchief folded small and tidy, as if intent upon a minor domestic errand that required neither speed nor apology. At the bend where the service stair door sat flush with the panelling, the light found more than wood and paint. There lay a fan of marks that had been almost cleaned, and not quite, the shy confession of feet that wished to be forgotten. The carpet there was newer than its neighbours, and retained small things the old pile would have chewed and swallowed. Across its nap ran 5 delicate crescents leading toward the stair, and 2 returning, thin at the tip and deep at the bite. A narrow heel had written them, and the writing had been done by a person who walked quickly and then more slowly. Near the threshold, a longer smear dragged backward over the last crescent, as if a broader shoe had come after and tried to persuade the first pattern to disappear. Miss Marple stooped and did not touch. She has learned that carpets like to keep their admissions a little longer if flattery is involved. She looked first where the light struck from the skylight, and then where the shadow pooled beneath the skirting. In the shadow a pinch of grit had collected, fine and pale, not from coal and not from polish, but the thin dust that clings to outdoor steps when rain has been a recent tutor. She lifted the handkerchief and pressed one corner gently to the skirting board, and raised it again. A faint azure dot had transferred, so faint it would have escaped any cloth less fond of truth. Blue again, she thought, and remembered the fleck on the stair and the fragment caught under a boy's nail. She listened for a moment to the stairwell breathing its cold breath, a smell of soap and rope and the honest fatigue of wood. From below came a voice counting spoons, and from above the hush of a corridor that thought itself empty. She stepped back as George appeared with a pot of coffee that steamed like an industrious chimney. He started and recovered, and would have passed without speech if she had not put a question between him and silence. "If you had to avoid the main staircase at night," she asked, "which turn would you take, and which step would you skip?" George looked at the door, and then at his shoes, and then at her face, discovered no trap, and answered, "The 3rd step down squeaks when it feels important, miss," he said, "and the landing shows more than it tells when the rain comes under the door." He hesitated and added, "And the light above the 2nd flight is fickle and would betray a person who wished to be uncounted." "Thank you," said Miss Marple, and she moved aside to allow both the coffee and the boy to proceed with honour. She traced the path of the crescents back along the corridor. Clearer at first, they faded where the runner met polished boards and reappeared faintly near a radiator where a drip had fallen in the night and awakened the dust. At the corner, where the corridor dog legged toward the guest rooms, a scrap of something dark lay tucked into the edge of the skirting like a letter that had failed to post itself. She coaxed it onto the handkerchief with a pin. It was a sliver of leather small as an eyelash, and dyed the sober black that shoes wear when they mean to be invisible. One edge showed the tiny puncture of a cobbler's stitch, and a smear of carmine so faint that it might have been a whisper. She thought of a glove with a stitched forefinger, and of a crescent of rouge left on wood at the desk. The light shifted as a door opened, 2 turnings away, and the tall woman came out, composed and exact as a letter that knows its address. She moved toward the lift with the calm of someone who has paid in advance. Her shoes had slender heels and neat rubber tips that made no noise at all on carpet, which is an achievement seldom accidental. At the lift she paused and looked down the back passage, as if she had remembered a word she had meant to use and decided against it. Then the lift opened and she was taken away by that patient mechanical horse. Miss Marple walked on to the landing and looked down the well of the service stairs. They fell in a square round the dull shine of the handrail, and the treads showed the ordinary marks of trays and boots and polishers' rags, and in one place the extraordinary small print of a heel that had not belonged to boots. It sat on the outside edge where hurried feet choose balance over modesty, and the print had not dried evenly. In the dampest place, a fine arc suggested a metal tip that had been replaced recently and still held its pride. The inspector came upon her then, quiet as inspectors learn to be, and he followed her gaze to the same small lie the carpet told. "We are late to this particular dance, madam," he said, without impatience. "Not so late that the band has gone home," she said, and showed him the handkerchief with its tiniest blue freckle. He examined it, said nothing, and examined the sliver of leather, and still said nothing, which was more encouraging than words. They went down a flight together, and paused at the turn of the stair, where the wall is convenient for hands that feel the urge to steady themselves. There, on the whitewash, a thumb had once rested and found itself recorded because it wore something perfumed and foolish. The faintest blush of orange clung, where a clean rag had been too gentle to succeed. The inspector looked toward the scullery and back to the whitewash, and his moustache portrayed thought with admirable economy. They reached the yard door, and looked out where the cobbles held thin puddles like coins saved for later. On the lowest stone of the step a brief suggestion of a heel had met the wet and carried it up, and a second larger shoe had smudged its companion into something like an apology. The yard today was sober and occupied by boxes that claimed innocence with labels and twine. Along the far wall a small smear of machine oil had crept where a cart had kissed the bricks and left its scent. The inspector sent a constable for the man with the whistling habits, and Miss Marple went back up with the serenity of a person whose day had chosen her work for her. She did not go to the lounge at once. She went to the linen store, where doors develop their personalities and cupboards remember who opened them last. She asked the housekeeper for a needle, which was given at once because needles are a kind of currency among the honest. She bent to the lowest shelf and examined the edge, where the mop pails scuff and the world is less often visited by polish. There, too, a bright dot of brass dust had lodged, and would have been swept an hour later if she had not quietly requested that the girl begin the upper shelves first. "You are very kind, madam," said the housekeeper, who was not unobservant and whose gratitude arrived in the form of information. She volunteered that a certain napkin of a good plain weave had gone missing yesterday, and that the barman declared it had strayed to the laundry, and that she did not suspect lies so much as she suspected indifference, which is worse for linen. Miss Marple thanked her with a small comment about starch, and left the store in better order than she found it, which always earns one more truth before sunset. In the palm court the society rings had not yet formed for the day, and the widow in pearls sat alone with a book she did not turn, and a cup that cooled untouched. Miss Marple chose a chair that allowed one half glance at the widow's clasp, and one half at the door to the service stair. The clasp's gold tongue shone as dutifully as ever, but the string lay with a new reluctance, as if the pearls had sulked at being handled before breakfast. The widow raised her eyes and lowered them again, and in that movement let everything be seen that she had not meant to permit. Fatigue lay upon her like a well-made shawl, expensive and concealing. The inspector joined Miss Marple with a nod that had the decency to apologize for its own intrusion. He reported with careful blandness that the locksmith recalled returning in the evening for an extra bit of filing, and that he had lent a hand by the yard steps to a lady who claimed a heel had caught in the gap where stone meets iron, and that she thanked him, and that she smelt faintly of orange, and that she had a habit of speaking as if nothing in the world had ever surprised her. "A curious habit in a world like this," said Miss Marple, and the inspector agreed by not disagreeing. From the hall George appeared with a telegram balanced on a tray and set it by the manager's elbow. The manager read it with an expression that desired to be neutral and failed. He folded it and placed it in his pocket with that peculiar tenderness people reserve for words that have cost money to send and more to keep. Miss Marple took a turn toward the writing table and pretended to consult the timetable of local trains. While she pretended, she observed the blotting pad provided for guests whose letters require privacy and ink. A ghost of yesterday's note had impressed itself there in the faintest of bruises. She looked and was content and did no more, because an inspector should be permitted the comfort of discovery once a day in his own hotel. At noon, the weather abandoned its scruples and let a clean wind in at the revolving door. With the wind came the watcher, who had made the canopy his parish. He entered briefly, looked at the board where the keys lived, and turned away in a manner that counted as news to anyone with a ledger. He spoke to no one, and took a seat where he could see the beginning of the service passage and the end of the corridor that held room 312, which is the geometry of men who are paid to expect a messenger. Miss Marple allowed the day to present its distractions and then removed them gently. She went again to the service stair in the mid-afternoon when the maids are bravest and the guests are least ambitious. There she found the crescents less distinct and the smear more so, as if tidiness had arrived with belated zeal. On the landing she discovered a pin, ordinary and bent, and caught upon its point a single short hair, the colour of smoke, not from a man's head and not from a child's, but that excellent middle colour that fashionable women render out of bottles when the world insists upon precision. She placed the pin beside the leather sliver on her folded handkerchief and resumed her quiet tour of the floor. Outside the door of the small salon, a faint scent remained that did not belong to food or to flowers. It was the tail of a perfume that had travelled late and returned earlier than it wished, and it had in it a green note beneath the orange, clever and subtle and more expensive than anyone admitted. She turned, very slowly, and looked along the empty corridor. In the dull metal of the fire bucket, she caught a minute reflection of a figure pausing behind her and going on, and though she could not swear to it, she could testify that the movement did not belong to a maid. At dusk, the inspector called for a constable to stand at the foot of the service stair, and another to watch the yard gate, not because he expected theatrics, but because trouble dislikes witnesses with boots. The hotel, sensing a new script, behaved beautifully. Silver shone and voices modulated, and the crystal bar remembered to be discreet. The widow dined in her room and sent back a tray on which the cloche covered nothing at all except the absence of appetite. The tall woman dined in the small salon and asked for oranges with her dessert, which was a choice that made the head waiter look at the inspector, and the inspector look at the window, and Miss Marple look at her knitting. Late that evening, Miss Marple returned once more to the stair, when footsteps have fewer alibis and carpets are more frank. The crescents had been all but brushed away, and yet on the second flight a single new mark had added itself, pointing upward, very fine at the tip and reluctant at the bite. Its partner was missing, as if the walker had paused upon one foot and listened. From above came the almost inaudible cry of a hinge, newly oiled. From below came the steady patience of a constable, who had decided he liked the company of stone. Miss Marple let the silence settle again and made her way to bed, not because she trusted the night to behave, but because she trusted people to behave, as they had already begun to do. In her room she wrote a short list that was longer than it seemed. She wrote that a woman's heel had walked toward the stair and paused at the landing and then gone down in haste and back in thought. She wrote that a second, broader shoe had followed to erase what it could, and had only achieved a smear. She wrote that blue had turned up where blue had no right, and that orange had chosen to be remembered on whitewash where even fingerprints had manners. She wrote that leather tells the truth when cloth does not, and that pearls may leave a hair in a place where pearls do not go unless their wearer is very angry or very brave. She closed the book and put out the light and lay listening to the hotel, which by now had learned its part. Somewhere a door moved by the width of a whisper, and stopped because a hand had bought itself some time with a key. Far away a watch ticked in a pocket that did not quite close. The sea said nothing useful and everything true. Miss Marple slept a little and woke a little, and sat up once, because the night had said a word in the corridor that it had not said before. It had said hurry, and it had said soon, and the stair, which had never lied, repeated both. Chapter 10. Truth in the Grand Ballroom. The chandeliers burned with a serene extravagance, and the polished floor waited like a polite lake. Chairs had been set in a half-circle at the foot of the dais, a formation that tells the truth it is expected presently. Guests and staff collected with the reluctance of people who wish to seem casual and cannot. The manager stood at one end, with his ledger closed like a mouth. The barman kept his hands folded and very clean. George the bellhop hovered at the edge of the circle with the hopeful terror of youth. The locksmith, fetched from his dinner, looked both proud and unhappy. The tall woman sat near the aisle with her gloves in her lap and her eyes on the door. The widow in pearls took the chair nearest the chandelier, and the pearls lay still as if they had found their last position. The inspector stood a little apart and allowed order to settle. Miss Marple rose from a plain chair and folded her hands, which is the right way to begin when one intends to be believed. "We have all been waiting for midnight," she said mildly, but the matter was decided before midnight was called upon to assist. The note under the silver cloche announced an appointment in 312 and wore 2 initials dressed in blue. It was placed where it would be found, and it was found, and in being found it performed the office for which it was written. It was not written by the man who died. It was written by a hand that meant us to remember the hour and forget the time of death. The doctor's opinion gives a span that ends earlier than the bell, at 12. The brandy that lay on the rug had not the smell of accident, but the arrangement of intention. A spill that obeys a line has been taught good manners by a living hand. The decanter showed a fall by measure, and the glass kept no fresh print upon its rim. There was the faintest bitterness in the spirit, and a thread of orange that did not belong to fruit. The orange was a mask, not a perfume. The poison was placed in the decanter before the last glass was poured. To enter unseen and early required a key that should not exist, and such a key was born yesterday. It was filed in a yard where brass dust still clung to the sill, and oil made its small confession to brick. It was paid for by a lady in calm gloves who asked the locksmith to visit the linen cupboard and put his cleverness to work, and then to return in the evening for a trifle more. He remembers a neat tear stitched across her forefinger and a courtesy that disliked being refused. "That lady is here among us." Miss Marple inclined her head toward the tall woman, who had gone very white and kept her eyes upon her lap. "You fetched the locksmith, madam, but you did not plan a murder. You believed you were arranging the recovery of letters that might compromise you and someone who does not deserve it. You read the notice about private dinners and you asked for the small salon at 7. Later you placed a folded paper beneath a cloche with a hand that wears a stitched glove. You placed it at the request of another and out of fear for yourself." She looked up, then down, and said nothing, which was as much as an admission could decently be. Miss Marple turned to the inspector and then to the assembled faces. The key itself was hidden behind a radiator in a napkin from the bar. It slept for an hour beneath the counter and woke in the service corridor. It opened a door in the afternoon while the lobby admired the weather's brief repentance. A woman entered room 312 with that key and poured death into the decanter while the world still believed in tea. She set the scene and went out by the service stair. The stair records everything when rain is in its temper. On the landing, a narrow heel wrote its delicate crescents and paused where the light is untrustworthy. On the wall, a thumb left the faintest orange upon whitewash, not perfume but the tail of a bitter essence handled without perfect care. On the lowest step outside the back door, the same heel met wet stone and climbed. Later, a second, broader shoe tried to tidy what the first had written, and achieved only a smear. In the room itself, a dark thread lay between desk and hearth, kinked as pearl strings are kinked when they have been tugged by a hand that has forgotten gentleness. The ash on the tray was a crescent set down for show, and the coasters were squared as if shame could be measured with a ruler. There is a habit of order in grief when grief has been practised. Miss Marple looked at the widow's clasp, a tiny gold tongue bright against the quiet arc of white. Pearls are strung on silk, and silk is dyed or undyed according to taste and purse. A single hair from such a string will keep its colour when the room has forgotten everything else. The thread I lifted was dark and fine, as your string is within, madam. Pearls also keep hair, and the pin I found upon the stair held one that matched yours as closely as a thing may and not be the same. The widow's hand moved an inch and stopped, and the pearls made a minute sound like breath. Miss Marple's voice remained as gentle as knitting. You quarrelled with the dead man 2 nights ago, in a silence that could be heard. Your husband and he were once concerned in ventures upon the coast, ventures that floated and then sank, and left you with the wreckage, and him with a yacht photograph and a tidy bank. He promised settlements that never matured, and when you became a widow, you discovered that grief was expected to be economical. You learned patience, and then you learned a different lesson. Yesterday you took from the board the key to 3, 1, 2 for a moment, when the concierge was looking elsewhere, and in that moment you pressed it upon wax so that a copy could be made. You did not care how the copy was procured, only that it should be procured. You persuaded this unhappy lady to engage the locksmith for a cupboard, and for a different purpose, by telling her that letters concerning her might be rescued if she were helpful. She allowed herself to be helpful because shame travels quickly and scruples walk. You went up by the service stair with the duplicate key while the hotel admired a patch of sun, and you worked your will in the quiet room and came down again by the same path. You left a fleck of your blue seal on the tread and a little orange on the wall and a heel on the step and a thread on the carpet and a silence in your face that had to be arranged. You dined later in grey silk and asked for tea, and you watched the cloche because you had contrived that it should say midnight and point the inspector toward a rendezvous that never took place. George carried a sealed envelope shortly before the hour and put it into a hand that thanked him and wished him to go. He smelt orange at the door because the glass already wore its mask. The boy is innocent, and his blue fragment is no more than the truth clinging where truth will. She turned to George and gave him the smallest nod, which set his mouth steady and his eyes bright. The inspector took a step and then waited, because Miss Marple had not quite done. "There remains the watcher under the canopy," she said. "He is not a constable, and not your friend, sir, but he is acquainted with certain offices that keep private ledgers. He was engaged to see whether a parcel arrived last night, and whether a message ran between 2 persons who have been mentioned. He saw you, madam, cross to the service arch at an hour that did not suit respectability. He saw you return by the same way, not long after the bell for the 2nd sitting. He did not see you go to the small salon at 7, because you did not go. You preferred your room and a tray, and the cloche covered only the absence of appetite and the presence of decision. The widow lifted her head and her eyes were very clear. She said that a woman alone must learn to defend herself when law has admired a gentleman's cleverness too long. She said that she had waited for justice, and had seen none, and had carried her sorrow with a straight back until it turned sharp and pointed. She said that the poison had been in the glass only as long as necessary, and that no one who did not deserve it had been endangered. She said that she had written the time under the cloche, because the world believes printed words more readily than correct ones. She said that she was tired, and that the pearls were too tight. The inspector stepped forward then, and did his office with courtesy, because admissions should be received as carefully as condolences. He asked for the shoes she had worn the day before, and for the little shell of blue wax she kept in her dressing case. He asked for the gloves she had had stitched after a long day, and she gave them and did not tremble. He handed the duplicate key to a constable, and put the other safely where it could do no further mischief. The tall woman rose, turned away, and then turned back. She said that her letters had been burned unread, and Miss Marple inclined her head and said that was handsome. The locksmith asked whether he ought to be ashamed, and Miss Marple told him that people are always more culpable than their tools. The manager began to speak of discretion, and found that the word had injured itself in his mouth. The barman breathed again for the first time in a day. George stood very straight, as though someone had polished him. Miss Marple sat down and looked for a moment at the chandelier, which had chosen a very good day to be clean. The sea beyond the windows was making its old argument with the wind, and was not impressed by us. "Truth does not glitter by itself," she thought, but it is much improved by clean glass and decent chairs. The ballroom returned to its business of being a room, and the hotel began to breathe as if it might sleep. The inspector thanked Miss Marple with a look that spared her words. She folded her gloves and stood, and the guests rose as people rise in church when the final hymn is understood at last. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the pavement remembered how to shine. The Grand Hotel, having been a lantern in the night, allowed itself to be a house again. Miss Marple went upstairs to write a little letter to no one in particular, and to put away her notebook with the sense of a task that has ended where it ought. Justice had come quietly, as it should, and the chandeliers were pleased to have seen it. Thank you so much for joining us for today's mystery. We're truly glad if you stayed with us all the way to the end. If you enjoyed the story, let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if it brought you even a little joy or comfort, consider leaving a like as a small sign of support. It really means a lot. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next quiet mystery waiting just around the corner. Until next time, stay curious and keep the kettle warm.